The rain hits the boarded window like buckshot. A 19-year-old veteran stands alone inside an abandoned watchmaker's shop, his right hand trembling, a folded letter pressed against his heart. At the back of the long, dark room, an 8-foot regulator clock stands silent. Its hands have not moved in 17 months. Behind it, hidden in the wall, something is waiting. A siren splits the night. Headlights wash across the front of the shop in slow, searching arcs. Tires hiss to a stop on wet asphalt. A heavy door opens. Boots strike the sidewalk. A bullhorn rises through the rain. Boy, come out or I'm coming in. He does not move. His left hand closes tighter around the letter. On the envelope in another man's careful hand, 4 words. When he comes home. The pounding starts again. Inside the silent clock behind 6 new brass screws, the truth is about to come out of the wall. The rain came down hard that November night in 1945. The kind of cold Vermont rain that hits the boarded windows like buckshot and seeps into a man's bones before he knows he's wet. Inside the abandoned watchmaker's shop on Mill Street in Millbrook, a 19-year-old boy stood alone in the dark, holding a flashlight he had carried through the mountains of northern Italy. His right hand was trembling. He had not been able to make it stop trembling since April. His name was Henry Caldwell, but the men who had died around him in the Apennines had called him Hank, and that was the only name that still felt real. The beam of the flashlight swept across shelves coated in 18 months of dust. It caught on a workbench worn smooth by another man's hands. It traveled along the pressed tin ceiling, the stamped floral pattern barely visible beneath the grime. And finally it settled on the thing standing at the back of the shop, against the rear wall, 8 feet tall, and silent as a closed grave. A master regulator clock, cherry wood case, white enamel dial, Roman numerals. Hands frozen at 4:47. Outside, a siren split the night. Headlights washed across the boarded front window in slow, searching arcs. A man's voice came through a bullhorn, thick and full of the kind of authority that does not ask twice. "Caldwell, I know you're in there. Come out, boy, or I'm coming in. Sheriff Earl Hocking." Hank turned the flashlight off. He stood in the absolute dark. His left hand closed tighter around a folded letter, the paper soft and yellowed at the edges, the ink run in places where some other hand had pressed too hard. On the front of the envelope, in a tradesman's careful script, for the Caldwell boy. When he comes home from the war. He had come home. But he did not yet know what home meant. He did not know that the next 48 hours would unmake everything he believed about his father, his grandfather, and the small Vermont town that had raised him. He whispered into the dark to a man who had been dead 17 months. "Mr. Thornton, I came back, but I don't know what to do now." The pounding on the door started again, harder this time. And somewhere deep in the chest of the silent regulator clock, something was waiting. Something his grandfather had hidden there a year before in the last summer, that any of them would call peaceful. This is the story of how a homeless 19-year-old veteran with $14 in his pocket and the clothes on his back walked into an abandoned clockmaker's shop and found a truth his family had spent a lifetime burying. It is the story of a war crime committed on a hillside in Tuscany. It is the story of a father who died twice, a grandfather who carried a secret to the edge of his grave, and a boy who learned that the most important sound in a watchmaker's shop is not the ticking. It is the silence where the ticking should be. But to understand that night, you have to go back to a kitchen table in 1933, when the Depression had its teeth in every working family in New England, and an old man placed a tarnished pocket watch in front of a 7-year-old boy and said the words that would shape everything to follow. Walter Caldwell had been a watchmaker for 32 years. He had served in France with the 26th Yankee Division in 1917, and he had come home with a slight tremor in his left hand, a bone-deep mistrust of officers, and a Hamilton Railroad-grade pocket watch that had belonged to a dying corporal named Nathaniel Pemberton. The men in the family called him Pop. He was 53 years old that autumn afternoon, his hair already going white at the temples, his hands enormous and rough but steady, always steady. Young Hank sat on a stool at the kitchen bench, swinging his legs above the floorboards. His father, Teddy, was out of work that month, picking up day labor where he could find it. His mother, Bee, gave piano lessons in the parlor for 50 cents an hour, and the smell of her coffee filled the small house on Cedar Street. The family had moved in with Pop when the paper mill in Brattleboro laid Teddy off in the spring, and the boy was learning what it meant to be poor without ever being told. Pop set the pocket watch on the bench between them. He did not say anything for a long time. He just looked at his grandson the way a man looks at a horse he is trying to gauge. Then he said, "Tell me what you see." The boy leaned forward. "A watch, Pop." "Look again." Hank looked. He saw the worn case, the cracked crystal, the second hand sweeping its small circle. He did not know what answer the old man wanted. "It's a watch," he said again, smaller this time. Pop reached out one of those big hands and turned the watch over. He pressed the catch on the back, and the case opened. And there inside was a world the boy had never seen. Gears no bigger than a thumbnail. A balance wheel swinging back and forth faster than the eye could follow. A tiny lever clicking against a notched wheel, one tooth at a time. And the sound of it when Pop held the open watch to the boy's ear was like a small, steady heart. "This is not a watch," Pop said. "This is a heart. Every second it beats once. If it beats, even the watch lives. If it beats crooked, the watch dies. A man is the same. You understand the difference?" The boy did not. Not then. He nodded anyway, because that was what you did when Pop spoke. Pop closed the case. He held the watch in his palm and looked at it like an old friend. "This belonged to a soldier named Nathaniel Pemberton. He died in my arms at Belleau Wood in 1918. He gave me this and he said, 'Walter, take it home. Don't let it stop.' I have wound it every morning at 6 o'clock for 20 years. A man is measured not by what he owns. He is measured by what he keeps." That was the first lesson. There would be many more. For 5 years, every Saturday and every long summer afternoon, the boy sat at Pop's bench and learned to listen. He learned that a mainspring fatigued before it broke, and you could hear the fatigue if you were patient. He learned that an escapement could be balanced or crooked, healthy or sick, and the difference was the difference between a clock that kept time for 50 years and one that lasted 5. He learned to clean a movement with benzene and a horsehair brush, to oil a pivot with a single drop on the tip of a needle, to regulate a balance wheel by turning a screw a quarter turn at a time, listening then a quarter turn again. By the time he was 12, he had repaired his first carriage clock for a retired schoolteacher in Saxton's River. By the time he was 14, he could diagnose a sick mainspring with his ear pressed to a clock case. He was Pop's apprentice without ever being called that, and the old man's quiet pride in him was the warmest thing in the small house on Cedar Street. Warmer even than his mother's piano music drifting from the parlor. And then the world ended. December 7th, 1941. The radio in the kitchen. His mother's hand frozen over the coffee pot. His father standing at the window with his face gone gray and still. Hank was 15 years old, and he watched his father turn from the window and walk to the closet and take down a wooden box from the top shelf. And inside the box was a Hamilton Railroad watch his father had carried since the year of his own marriage. And Teddy held that watch in his palm and looked at it for a long time. And then he looked at his son. "Boy," he said, "I'm going to go fight." He enlisted 6 months later at the age of 34, when most men his age were trying to find ways out. He told Hank the night before he left for basic training, "Your grandfather went to France in 17. Now it's my turn." There are some things a man has to do even when he is afraid, especially when he is afraid. He was assigned to the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, and in September of 1943, he came ashore at Salerno in Italy under fire so heavy that half his squad was dead before they reached the beach. The letters home that first year were full of small jokes and reassurances. The food was bad, the wine was good. The Italian people were generous and broken. He missed his wife's piano and his son's quiet seriousness and his father's stubborn presence at the dinner table. And then in November of 1944, the letters stopped. 2 weeks later, a Western Union telegram came to the house on Cedar Street, and B. Caldwell read it, standing at the kitchen sink, and slid slowly to the floor without making a sound. Theodore Caldwell, Sergeant, United States Army, killed in action on the Apennine Front. A flag-draped coffin was delivered in the spring. Hank, 18 years old now, stood beside his mother at the cemetery in a borrowed black suit, and he understood for the first time that grief was not loud. Grief was a thing that settled into a room and changed the temperature. His mother never recovered. She wore black for the rest of her life, which would not be long. Hank enlisted within the month. His mother signed the papers because she was too tired to fight him. He shipped out for Italy in January of 1945, assigned to the 88th Infantry Division, the Blue Devils. And in the cold Italian rain, he walked the same mountains his father had walked, looking for ghosts that would not show themselves. He met Daniel Holloway at the replacement depot in Naples. Danny was 20 years old, red-headed and freckled from Burlington, Vermont, only 80 miles from Millbrook. They became friends in the way that men become friends in war, which is to say all at once and without negotiation. They shared their rations. They split their cigarettes. They wrote letters home and proofread each other's grammar. Danny had a mother named Helen and a kid brother named Lawrence, 16 years old. And Danny talked about Larry the way men talk about something they are afraid they will never see again. The winter campaign was hell. The mountains were cold and steep, and the Germans had every road zeroed. Men died in mud. Men died in snow. Men died of trench foot and pneumonia and friendly artillery. and the slow, grinding misery of a war that everyone knew was nearly over. But that refused to end. On the night of April 14th, 1945, Hank and Danny were part of a patrol moving up the Imola Road toward Bologna. The vineyard had been quiet all afternoon. The Germans, they thought, were already pulling back to the Po River. The Germans were not pulling back. The mine took Danny's right leg below the knee. He did not scream. He looked down at where his leg had been, and then he looked up at Hank with an expression of polite surprise, as if someone had told him a joke he did not quite understand. Hank tore his own bootlace off and tied a tourniquet by feel because the medic was 40 yards away under fire. He pressed his hands against the place where Danny's leg ended, and he felt his friend's blood pumping against his palms, and he said the only thing he could think of to say, "Stay with me, Danny. Stay with me. You're gonna see Larry again." Danny reached into his jacket. He brought out a pocket watch on a worn leather thong. He pressed it into Hank's hand. "My granddad's," he said. "Waltham, 1898. Take it to my mother. Promise me." "I'm not promising. You'll take it to her yourself." "Hank, promise me." Hank promised. Danny died on the stretcher before they reached the aid station. The Waltham watch went into Hank's pocket, and it stayed there through the rest of the war, through VE Day in May, through the long occupation summer. When the boys waited for transport home through the cable that arrived in June, telling him his mother had died of pneumonia in a Vermont hospital while he was 8,000 miles away, he could not get leave in time. His mother was buried beside an empty coffin 2 weeks before her son returned to American soil. Hank Caldwell came home to Millbrook, Vermont in August of 1945. With the watch his father had carried into Italy in one pocket, and a Waltham 1898 in the other, and $137 of mustering out pay, and no living mother and no father, and a house on Cedar Street that had been sold to pay her medical bills. He went to see his grandfather, who was 65 now, and living in a small rented apartment in Brattleboro. His hands gone bad with arthritis. His eyes still sharp as new glass. Pop still carried his own. Hamilton, the Pemberton watch, the one from Belleau Wood, the one he had wound every morning at 6 o'clock since 1918. Pop took one look at his grandson and said, "You can't stay here, boy. I can barely take care of myself. You need a place. You need work." So Hank slept in the cab of Pop's old Ford Model A, parked behind the Methodist Church on Federal Street for the next 3 months. He took whatever day labor he could find. He could not hold a job longer than 2 weeks. His hands shook. He could not sleep. When he did sleep, he saw Danny's face in the mud and woke up tasting iron. There was no name yet for what was wrong with him. They would not coin one for another 40 years. He thought he was simply broken in a way that could not be repaired, and he was beginning in a quiet way to plan how he would end it. That was the boy who walked into May's Diner on a November afternoon in 1945 and spent his last 10 cents on a second cup of coffee. The woman who sat down beside him at the counter was in her mid-50s, gray hair, dressed in a wool coat that had seen many winters. She did not look at him when she ordered. She let the waitress pour her coffee. She let 2 minutes pass. Then she said, without turning her head, "You're Walter Caldwell's grandson." He looked at her. He did not speak. I know it because of how you hold that cup. My husband held his cup the same way when he came home from France in 1919. Some things you carry in your hands. Her name was Mabel Thornton. Her husband, Elias, had been the last working watchmaker in Millbrook. He had served with Pop in the 26th Yankee Division in France, and the two men had been friends for 30 years afterward, drinking their Saturday morning coffee together. At this same diner from 1925 until the year before, when Elias had finally been too sick to come. Elias Thornton had died of a heart attack in August of 1944. He had closed his shop on Mill Street several months before that. And before he closed it, before he died, he had left certain things in that shop. And he had told his wife to wait. He told me, Mabel said, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, that if the Caldwell boy came home from the war, I was to give him the key. He said your grandfather had brought something to him in the autumn of 1944. He said you would need it. He said when you came back, you would need a place to begin again. Hank stared at her. How did he know I would come back? Because your grandfather told him you would. The day before Elias closed the shop, Walter said Elias the boy is going to go to war like his father did. He is going to see things. But he will come home. And when he does, he will need a reason to live. You hold it for him. She reached into her coat pocket. She placed a brass key on the counter between them. The key was heavy and dark with age, and it looked like something that had been waiting a very long time. It's the original key, she said. Elias gave it to me the week before he died. I have held it for 17 months. The shop is at number 17 Mill Street. The front window is boarded. The town has talked about tearing the building down. But a certain man in this town has been blocking that vote. I don't know why he wants the building, but I know he wants it. And I know you should be careful of him. Who? The sheriff. Earl Hocking. He came home from the war this past summer, and the town gave him the badge in June. Mr. Hocking has been to the shop 3 times since Elias died. Once with a contractor, twice alone late at night. He has tried through certain quiet channels to have the property transferred to the town for back taxes. Edward Fairchild at the clerk's office has so far prevented it. But Edward is 70 years old, and Edward will not be there forever. Hank closed his hand around the brass key. Why are you giving this to me? Because my husband asked me to, and because when I look at your face, I see your grandfather, and because something in that shop is yours. It has always been yours, even if you don't know it yet. He walked out of May's diner into a cold November dusk, and he stood on the sidewalk of Main Street, looking down toward Mill Street, where a boarded-up watchmaker's shop sat empty in the fading light. He stood there for a long time, and for the first time since Danny had died in his hands in a vineyard above Bologna, he felt something other than gray weight in his chest. He felt the small, bright pull of a question he had to answer. The next morning, before the sun was up, Hank Caldwell walked down Mill Street with the brass key in his hand. The shop was narrow, 2 stories, white clapboard going to gray. The boards over the front window were swollen with damp. The sign hanging above the door was barely legible, Thornton Watches and Clocks, established 1922. He put the key in the lock. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then turned with a low, metallic certainty, the way a good lock turns when it has been kept oiled in advance against an arrival no one knew was coming. The door opened. The smell hit him first. Old wood. brass polish gone to dust, watch oil from another decade, and underneath that, the cold, dry smell of a room that had been sealed against the seasons for a long, long time. He stepped inside. The shop was one long room, perhaps 30 feet deep. Plank floor scarred from decades of use. Plaster walls cracked in places, the pressed tin ceiling stamped with a floral pattern that must once have been beautiful. A workbench ran along the left wall, fitted with small drawers and pigeonholes for tools, every drawer closed, every tool in its place. Shelves along the right wall held wound-down mantel clocks under cotton sheets, and beneath the sheets the shapes of the clocks made a kind of ghostly congregation. And at the back of the shop, against the rear wall, 8 feet tall, stood the master regulator. Cherry wood case, white enamel dial, Roman numerals. Hands stopped at 447. He walked to it the way a man walks towards something that has been waiting for him. He put one hand on the polished cherry. He listened the way Pop had taught him to listen. And what he heard was not absence. It was presence. The silence of a room holding its breath. "I'm 12 years late," he whispered. "I'm sorry." He opened the glass door of the regulator's case. The movement was visible inside. The gear train, the escapement, the pendulum rod. But the mainspring barrel was empty. Someone had deliberately removed the heart of the clock and left only the frame. The bare brass plates gleamed dully in the gray morning light, coming through the cracked panes above the boards. He stepped behind the regulator. There was a narrow space between the clock case and the rear wall. He looked at the back of the case, and he saw what he was meant to see. 6 brass screws holding a mahogany panel against the back of the case. The screws were new, brighter than anything else in the shop. They did not match the original construction. Someone had put them there on purpose, intending them to be found. He took a screwdriver from the workbench. The handle had been worn smooth by another man's grip. He backed out the screws one by one and set them in a row on the workbench. And when the last screw came free, the panel fell into his hands. Behind the panel was a cavity, perhaps 8 inches deep, set into the wall itself. And inside the cavity were 4 things: a coiled mainspring in a black brass barrel, the steel still bright through 40 years of oil, a heavy canvas pouch the size of a man's fist, a folded letter in a leather envelope, the leather darkened with age, and lying alone at the bottom of the cavity, a pocket watch, a Hamilton Railroad grade watch, twin to the one Pop still carried in Brattleboro. He picked it up. His hand was no longer shaking. He pressed the catch. The case opened. And inside the back cover, in fine engraver's script, were 4 words: TC 1944. For my son when he needs it. T.C. Theodore Caldwell. His father who had died on a hillside in Tuscany in November of 1944. His father whose watch was here in a Vermont shop wall, engraved with a date in the same year of his supposed death, unless the watch had been engraved by another hand. Unless someone had carried it east from a hospital in Florence and put it here for safekeeping. Unless the story Hank had carried in his chest for 14 months. The story of how his father had died was not the whole story, was not perhaps the story at all. Outside the shop, a car door slammed. He had not heard the engine. The walls were thick. The door was closed and his attention had been entirely consumed by the object in his hand. Boots on the sidewalk. Heavy. 2 men. They were already at the door. Caldwell. The voice was deep and sure of itself. A man who did not expect to be made to wait. "I know you're in there. Open up." Hank slid the watch and the canvas pouch and the leather envelope into the inside pocket of his coat. He pushed the mahogany panel back into the cavity but did not bother with the screws. He stepped out from behind the regulator and walked the length of the shop, and he opened the door. Sheriff Earl Hawking stood on the threshold. He was 37 years old, 6 feet 2 broad through the chest, his face still carrying the hard color of recent military service. Beside him stood a smaller man, a Deputy 28, mouth-thin, hands resting on his belt. The deputy's name was Travis Burdick, and he would be of importance later. The sheriff filled the doorway like he intended to stay. Hawking looked Hank up and down with the assessing patience of a man who has been preparing for this meeting. "So, you're the kid back from Italy, Walter Caldwell's grandson. Word is you've been making yourself at home. Sheriff, this building belongs to me. Mabel Thornton gave me the key." Hawking smiled with no warmth at all. "Mabel Thornton is a widow. She has no authority to convey property. This building belongs to the town. It's in the process of being seized for unpaid taxes. I'll check with the clerk's office." Hawking did not move from the threshold. His eyes traveled past Hank down the length of the shop, and they came to rest on the master regulator at the far wall. He looked at it for what felt like a long time. Then he walked past Hank into the shop uninvited, the deputy following 2 steps behind, and he went straight to the regulator. He laid his hand on the cherrywood case. He looked through the open glass door at the empty mainspring barrel. He turned around. "Anything behind this clock, Caldwell?" "Just the wool, Sheriff." Hawking watched him. A long, level military officer's watching. Then he smiled, and the smile had teeth in it. "You're a poor liar, boy. Just like your grandfather. Just like your father." The room went still. Hank kept his face flat, but every nerve in him had come awake. His father had died in Italy in November of 1944. Earl Hawking had been a captain in the European theater. Hawking had been mustered out and come home to Vermont and taken the sheriff's badge in June of 1945, 3 months before Hank himself had set foot back on American soil. Sheriff Hawking should not have known Teddy Caldwell at all. Sheriff Hawking should not have an opinion on whether Teddy Caldwell was a poor liar, unless they had met, unless their paths had crossed somewhere they were not supposed to cross, unless the war had put them in a room together, and one of them had walked out, and one of them had not. Hawking moved toward the door. At the threshold he turned and he looked Hank in the eye, and he spoke quietly. "You have 48 hours, Caldwell. Bring me clean title to this building or I will take it. And then I will go through every drawer and every shelf and every wall, as is my right under the seizure statute. You understand me, boy?" He did not wait for an answer. He walked out. The deputy followed. The door closed behind them. Hank stood alone in the long, quiet shop. The master regulator was silent. The shelves of sleeping clocks under their cotton sheets were silent. The pressed tin ceiling looked down on him like a witness. He sat down on the plank floor. He took the leather envelope from his coat. He opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written in the careful tradesman's hand of Elias Thornton, the ink faded to brown by 17 months of waiting. He read the first line. Dear Hank, if you are reading this, you have come home from the war alive. Your grandfather told me you would. He also told me something else. Something about your father, Theodore. Something you do not know. And something that Sheriff Hawking must never be allowed to find out. Your father did not die in Italy in November of 1944. Not the way you were told. The letter slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. Outside the boarded window, the November light was already going. Inside the shop, a 19-year-old veteran sat on the cold planks of a watchmaker's floor, and he understood with a clarity that came up through him like cold water that everything he believed about his family had been built on a story. The man who had stood in this shop 10 minutes ago, the sheriff of this town, knew the truth and had built his own life on top of it. To find out what had happened to his father, he was going to have to walk straight at that man and not look away. He picked up the letter. He folded it carefully. He slid it back into the leather envelope and into the inside pocket of his coat against his heart. In the back of the shop, the master regulator stood silent in the gathering dark. Its empty mainspring barrel waited for the spring that lay coiled in his pocket. Its frozen hands waited for the hand of a man who knew how to start it. He looked at the clock. He spoke to it. All right, he said. All right. We start tomorrow. And somewhere out in the November rain, Sheriff Earl Hawking sat in his car with the engine running, and he looked back at the boarded shop on Mill Street, and he understood that the boy he had just met was not going to leave. The boy was Teddy Caldwell's son. And Teddy Caldwell, in the end, had never left either. The war that had begun in a Tuscan village in the autumn of 1944 was not over. It had only just come home. The letter sat in his hand like something living. Hank Caldwell had read the first line and felt the floor of the world drop out from under him. Now, sitting on the cold planks of a shop that did not yet feel like his in the gray November light, coming through the cracks in the boarded window, he steadied his breathing the way Pop had taught him to steady his hands at the bench. Slow in, slow out. He read the rest of the letter. He read it 3 times. The first time he could not understand it. The words slid past him like rain on glass. The second time, sentences began to catch and hold. The third time, he read it aloud in a whisper, because he needed his own voice to carry the truth into the room. Elias Thornton had written in his patient watchmaker's hand that Theodore Caldwell had been wounded in the autumn campaign in Tuscany in October of 1944. While recovering at a field hospital outside Florence, he had been called as the sole surviving witness to a war crime committed by his company commander, Captain Earl Hawking. The crime had occurred in a small hillside village called Castelvecchio. A family of 11, including 3 children, had been murdered in their own home for the gold their ancestors had buried during the Mussolini years. 2 other American soldiers, Carson and Muller, had carried out the killings on Hawking's order. Teddy Caldwell had tried to stop it and had been beaten unconscious for his trouble. Within 5 weeks of the killings, Carson and Muller were both dead in what were called accidents in the official paperwork. Teddy was the last man alive who had been in that house. A court-martial was convened. Without corroborating witnesses, the case fell apart. Hawking walked out of the proceeding with his rank intact and his eyes on the one man who could still hang him. He made it clear in the indirect way such men do that he knew where Teddy Caldwell's wife and son lived. He knew the address on Cedar Street in Millbrook, Vermont. A JAG officer named Frederick Westbrook understood what was about to happen. He had seen it before. He arranged what the Army quietly called a witness disposition, a procedure that would not be formalized for many years to come. A combat death was staged. A flag-draped coffin weighted with sandbags was sent home to a grieving family. And Theodore Caldwell, under the name John Mathers, was put on a hospital ship to California with what was left of his lungs. It was in the Florence Field Hospital in the days between the failed court-martial and the staged death that Teddy had taken his own Hamilton watch off his wrist and asked a chaplain for the favor of having 4 words engraved on the inside of the case. TC 1944. For my son when he needs it. The watch went east in the same hand-carried packet that brought the first of the Castelvecchio coins traveling by way of a sympathisant who owed Frederick Westbrook a favor, and a series of locked Army mail sacks that did not pass through any civilian post office. Teddy understood that the day might come when his son needed proof that his father had still been alive after that November. He gave the watch the date so the date could not be argued. He lived 11 months under his new name. He lived in a small boarding house in Sacramento. He worked when he was able in a watch and clock shop owned by an old man who asked no questions. He wrote 17 letters to his father in Vermont, and those letters were carried by hand by the same sergeant. He died of pneumonia and the long damage of a chest wound on September 2nd of 1945, 2 weeks after VJ Day. 2 months before his son walked into a watchmaker's shop on Mill Street, he had died alone. His wife had died alone 2 months before him in a Vermont hospital, never told the truth. His son had been in Italy, walking the same mountains his father had walked, looking for a ghost that was still alive on the other side of the country. That was the truth. Elias Thornton had written it out in 3 patient pages, and at the end he had written, "The gold in the pouch is 47 Liberty Head quarter eagles. They were the part of the Castelvecchio gold that your father concealed in his kit before Hawking could take all of it. He hid it because he understood even then that it would be evidence. Westbrook sent the coins and the engraved watch to your grandfather through the same back channels. Walter could not trust the local banks. Hawking had a man inside the Millbrook Bank, so Walter brought it all to me in the autumn of 1944, and we hid it in the wall of this shop, where Hawking would never think to look. Each coin bears the small struck mark, ITA 44. That mark was used by Army quartermasters in Italy in 1944 to inventory recovered specie. Any qualified historian will recognize it. The coins are evidence. They are also yours. The decision of what to do with them is yours and yours alone. One more thing. The deed to this building was transferred to your name on the 5th of July, 1944. The transfer is recorded in the office of Windham County. Hawking cannot take this building from you. He can only frighten you. Do not be frightened. Be the man your father and grandfather already know you are. Your father's friend, Elias Thornton. August 14th, 1944. Hank folded the letter. He did not cry. The crying would come later in the dark when no one was watching. He set the letter on the workbench. He took the canvas pouch and emptied it carefully onto the bench. 47 small gold coins rolled out and lay in the watery November light like another man's hoarded years. He picked one up and turned it over and saw on the rim the tiny struck letters ITA 44. His father had touched these coins. His father had hidden them against the day they would mean something. His father had lived 11 months longer than the world had told him, and Hank had not known, and now he never would. He laid the coin down on the workbench. He stood up. There was work to be done. The morning was cold and clear when he walked to the town clerk's office. The frost was thick on the grass in front of the Methodist church. Edward Fairchild was waiting at his desk, as if he had known the boy would come. And perhaps he had. He was a small, careful man of 70, his spectacles thick. His hands liver-spotted, his bearing the bearing of a man who had carried his own quiet war for many years. He had served with Pop and Elias in France in 1918. He was the third of the three. "You are Hank Caldwell," he said. "Elias told me you would come. I have held your papers for 17 months. He opened a wooden filing drawer and produced a folder. Inside were the deed of transfer for the property at number 17 Mill Street, dated July 5th of 1944, signed by Elias Thornton and witnessed by Edward Fairchild, and recorded at the Windham County Registrar's Office in Newfane on the same afternoon. The title was clean. The conveyance was perfect. No tax was owed. No lien attached. The building was his and had been his for 16 months while he was walking through Italian mud not knowing. Edward Fairchild slid the folder across the desk. "Carry these papers on your person, son. If the sheriff makes another move, this is your weapon. He has asked me twice for the file on this building. I have told him both times that I cannot find it. I am 70 years old, and I do not lie easily. But I have lied to that man, and I will lie to him again, and I will keep lying to him until he is no longer the sheriff of this town." Hank looked at the old man across the desk and felt for the first time since coming home the warm pressure of an inherited tribe. The men who had stood with Pop in 1918 had stood with him still. Elias was dead, and the shop was his. Edward was here behind a desk, and the papers were his. And Pop himself, 65 and arthritic, was waiting in a small apartment in Brattleboro to be told that his grandson had finally come home. "Thank you, sir," Hank said. "I'll come back if I need you." "You will need me. He is not finished, you understand that." "I understand." The first attack came 3 days later. A fire inspector arrived at 8 in the morning. A soft-faced man named Pruitt with a clipboard and a pencil, and the unmistakable scent of hawking on him. He walked through the shop with the bored authority of a man who had been told what he would find before he came. He sighted the wiring. He sighted the chimney. He sighted the cellar joists. He wrote out a notice condemning the structure unless $4,000 in repairs were completed within 30 days. $4,000 in 1945 was the price of a small house. Pruitt left the citation on the workbench and walked out without meeting the young veteran's eye. Hank stood looking at the paper for a long time. Then he took $10 from his pocket and drove the old Model A north to Brattleboro and paid an independent inspector, an engineer named Mortensen, 50 cents on the dollar to come down and look at the shop with honest eyes. Mortensen spent 2 hours in the building. He came up out of the cellar with cobwebs in his hair and said, "Son, this is good frame construction. Some pointing on the chimney. A new run of wire to the back room. $500 less if you do the demo yourself." He drove back to Millbrook with the inspector's report on the seat beside him, and he filed it at Edward Fairchild's desk. And Edward Fairchild looked at it and almost smiled. "It begins," the old clerk said. The second attack came a week later. He woke before dawn to the sound of breaking glass. He had been sleeping on a folding cot in the back of the shop, an army blanket over him, the cold of the plank floor coming up through the thin pad. He was on his feet before he was awake. The old combat reflex in his blood, the one he had brought home from the Italian mountains. He moved to the front of the shop and saw through the splintered front window the dim outline of his Model A in the street. The driver's side window was shattered. A folded square of paper sat on the seat in a puddle of broken glass. He walked out into the cold without a coat. He picked up the paper. He read it in the streetlight at the corner. "Children shouldn't play with fire, Caldwell. Go away." He read it twice. He folded it. He put it in his pocket. He walked back into the shop and stood for a long time at the workbench and thought about Danny Holloway in a vineyard above Bologna, with one leg gone and the wet light fading from his eyes. He thought about all the things in his life that had been worth being afraid of. And he understood that a piece of paper on a car seat was not on that list and never would be. He swept up the glass. He drove the Model A to a yard in Bellows Falls in the morning and paid $8 for a new pane and installed it himself. He came home and put a fresh pot of coffee on the camp stove and went to work cleaning the master regulator's movement. The third attack came at dusk. Sheriff Earl Hocking came alone this time. No deputy. No sound of the cruiser. He walked in on his own 2 feet and pushed the door closed behind him and stood with his back to the lock, as if his back was the only door that mattered. $2,000, he said. Cash, today. You leave Millbrook tonight. He did not sit. He did not take off his hat. 2,000 cash, and I tear this building down before the snow. Nobody ever has to know it was here. You start over in Boston or Hartford or anywhere south of here. That is the best offer you are going to see, boy. Take it. Hank set down the small screwdriver he had been using. He turned on the stool and faced the sheriff across the length of the shop, and he was aware of the master regulator standing silent at his shoulder, of the empty mainspring barrel of the gold coins back in their wool cavity now, of the letter folded against his chest. Why do you want it so much, Sheriff? For half a second, Hocking's eyes drifted to the master regulator. They came back to Hank's face quickly, but the half second had been enough. Your grandfather, Hocking said, won this building off me in a card game in 1940. I bet the deed. He took it. I want back what was mine. It was a story, and it was a poor one. Pop had never gambled in his life. Pop had been a man who could hear the cheating in a deck of cards from across the room, and who had told his grandson Boy, a man who plays for what he didn't earn, has decided in advance that he is willing to steal. The shop had been Elias Thornton's free and clear. since 1922. Hawking knew that. Hawking was lying for the sake of lying the way a guilty man lies when he has stopped expecting to be believed. "Sheriff, I'm not selling." Hawking did not move. The room held its breath. Then the sheriff said very quietly, "You are a stupid kid, Caldwell, just like your father." It was the second mistake he had made. The first had been at the threshold of the shop 3 weeks earlier, when he had told Hank he was a poor liar like his father. That had been a slip. It had told Hank that Hawking had known Teddy Caldwell. This second mistake confirmed the first. Hawking had used the present tense for a man who had been officially dead for 14 months. You are stupid just like your father. Not just like your father was. Hawking still thought of Teddy Caldwell as a living rival. The dead do not need to be insulted in the present tense. Only the dead who never died can do that. Hank kept his face still. "Good night, Sheriff." Hawking did not move for a long time. Then he pushed himself off the door and walked back out into the dark, and the door swung shut behind him, and the latch clicked, and Hank Caldwell sat alone in his shop, with his ears ringing the way they used to ring after a mortar round walked too close. Mabel Thornton came the next morning. She carried a small wooden box. She set it on the workbench without ceremony. 11 letters, she said, from your grandfather to my husband, dated between the autumn of 1944 and the summer that Elias died. I did not give them to you when you came home, because you were not ready. I think you are ready now." She walked back out to her car. He read the letters at the workbench in the order they had been written. In them his grandfather's voice came back to him in full. The plain Yankee diction, the short sentences, the deep, stubborn love hidden under every sparse phrase. Pop had written to Elias about the loss of his only son, about the second life Teddy had been forced into, about the gold in the wall, about the captain who had killed 11 Italians for it, and the lieutenant who had brought the survivor home in pieces. Pop had written about the boy in Italy, about the worry, the dread, the daily grinding fear that this boy too would not come back. And in the last letter, dated only 6 weeks before Elias died, Pop had written, "Elias, my heart is not what it was. If I am not the one to tell him when he comes home, you have to tell him. He is going to be a young man with the war still on him. He will be no good for steady work. He will need somewhere to begin. Give him the key. Give him the gold. Give him the letter. Let him decide what to do with the truth. That is what Teddy would have wanted. Walter." Hank closed the box. He laid both hands on top of it and pressed down as if to keep it from floating away. And then he did the only thing he had not yet done. He cried. Quietly, the way men of that country cried without sound, only the slow seep of water down the side of the nose and the shoulders trembling. He cried for his grandfather still alive in a Brattleboro apartment, who had carried this weight for 14 months, while his only son rotted in a California grave under another man's name. He cried for his father, who had spent his last summer dying alone in a boarding house bed 3,000 miles from the people he loved. He cried for his mother, who had gone to her grave believing she was a widow, when she was not yet quite one. He cried for Danny Holloway. He cried finally for himself, the boy he had been before all of this. 1944. Then he wiped his face on his sleeve. He got up. He drove the Model A to Brattleboro that afternoon, and he sat with his grandfather in the small apartment on Putnam Street. And the two men did not talk about it for an hour. They drank coffee and looked at the gray river. And then Pop said, "Boy, I am sorry." "You don't owe me sorry, Pop." "I do." He wanted to be the one to tell you. He was going to be the one to tell you. He did not have time. Pop got up. He went to a closet and took down a tin cigar box and brought it to the small table by the window. Inside the box were 17 letters in his son's handwriting. The envelopes addressed in care of a Sacramento boarding house. The return address always the same false name. The postmarks running from December of 1944 through August of 1945. "Read the last one," Pop said. "Then the others. Read them in your own time. They are yours now." Hank read the last letter at the small table by the window with the gray river running below. "Dad, I do not think I will see October. The chest is bad and getting worse. I cannot meet Hank one last time, and that is the only thing I regret. When he comes home, please tell him I loved him every second of every one of his 19 years. Tell him I am not sorry for any of it except not being able to hold him one more time. There is one more thing. There is a second witness. His name is George Whitfield, Staff Sergeant B Company 36th Division. He saw everything. He was too afraid to testify in 1944. Westbrook has located him. He's on a small farm outside Skowhegan, Maine. If Hank wants to put Hocking on trial, Whitfield is the only living man who can help him do it. Tell him. Tell him I would be proud either way." Hank read the letter through to the end. He laid it down on the table. He looked at his grandfather, and his grandfather looked back at him. "What do you want to do, boy?" He thought about Castelvecchio. He thought about 3 children buried in their own kitchen for a handful of antique coins. He thought about Carson and Muller dead within weeks because they had said yes when they should have said no. He thought about Teddy Caldwell, lying in a California boarding house bed, writing this letter with the breath he had left, asking nothing for himself. He thought about Danny Holloway asking him to promise. He had promised. "I'm going to Maine," he said. He drove east the next morning. The snow began in New Hampshire and was steady by the time he crossed into Maine. The Model A's wipers had to be cleared by hand every 15 miles. He arrived at George Whitfield's farm at 9 in the evening with his hands cramped from the wheel and a thermos of cold coffee on the floorboard beside him. The farmhouse stood on a ridge above a frozen field. 2 hounds barked from inside. A porch light came on. A man came out onto the porch in a wool coat and stood there with the light behind him, so Hank could not see his face. "Who is it?" "My name is Hank Caldwell. I'm Teddy Caldwell's son. I came about Castelvecchio." The man on the porch did not move for a long minute. Then he said, "Come in, son. Get out of the cold." George Whitfield was 41 years old and looked 60. His hands shook when he poured the whiskey. He sat his guest at the kitchen table and put 2 glasses between them, and did not drink his own. The wood stove ticked in the corner. The hounds lay flat at his feet and watched the stranger with no menace at all. "I have been holding this for 14 months, Whitfield said. "I want you to know that before I start. I've been trying to die since I got home. My wife found me with the barrel of my service .45 in my mouth last September. She walked out the next morning. I have nothing left in this house except those 2 dogs, and a debt I cannot pay. I'm going to tell you what I saw in Castelvecchio. Then you can decide what to do with me." He told it. He told it for almost 2 hours, slowly looking down at the table, his hands flat on the wood. He told about the village on the hillside, about the Conti family, about the 8-year-old, the 11-year-old, the 14-year-old, about Hawking giving the order, about Carson and Muller pulling the triggers, about Teddy Caldwell rising up off his knees and being struck down with the butt of a rifle, about the gold pulled out of a hidden floor compartment under the old iron stove, about the captain dividing the coins into 3 uneven piles and laughing, about what came after. Carson drunk in Florence 2 weeks later, killed in a back alley fight with no witnesses. Muller found in the Arno River with his pockets full of stones 3 weeks after that. Whitfield alive only because he had eaten his own tongue at the court-martial, and said the captain had been on the other side of the village when the killings happened. "I am ready now," Whitfield said. "I should have been ready in '44. I was not. I will tell what I saw. I will tell it to whoever you bring. I will tell it under oath in a courtroom, and I will tell it to a priest, and I will tell it to a newspaper. I will tell it until I am not the man who let those children die for nothing." Hank closed his hand over Whitfield's wrist on the table. He did not say anything. He held the wrist for a long time. Then he said, "Pack a bag. You're coming back to Vermont with me. I know who to call." The next 2 weeks moved like a clock with all the pivots freshly oiled. Frederick Westbrook, the JAG officer who had saved Teddy in 1944, had since left the Army and opened a small law office on Tremont Street in Boston. Hank wrote to him and got a telegram back within 48 hours. "Bring the witness, bring the gold, bring the letters. We will go to the Bureau." Westbrook brought in a special agent of the FBI named Caroline Brennan out of the Boston field office. Brennan was 38 years old, one of the women Hoover had brought in during the war years, when there were not enough men to do the work. She was Irish on her mother's side and Yankee on her father's, and she had a way of listening that made a man tell more than he had planned to tell. She came to Millbrook at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in early February and sat at the workbench of the shop with Hank and Mabel and Edward and Whitfield, and she examined every piece of evidence in a careful, methodical order. The 43 coins remaining, the struck mark ITA 44, the engraved Hamilton dated 1944, the 11 letters from Pop to Elias, the 17 letters from Teddy under the name John Mathers, the deed of conveyance, the 2 affidavits drafted that night, one from Whitfield and one from Westbrook himself. By dawn, she had the whole shape of the case in her head, and she set her pen down on the bench and looked at Hank. "I can win this case, Mr. Caldwell, but understand what is about to happen. When I open this file in Boston, the sheriff is going to know. Word will move. He has friends in the State House in Montpelier and in 2 banks, and in at least 1 judge's chamber that we know of. He is going to come at the witnesses. I need all of you somewhere I can watch. I'm not leaving the shop. Mr. Caldwell, this is my shop. I have run from one place already in my life. I'm not running from another." She looked at him a long time. Then she nodded once the way an officer nods when she has been told something she did not want to hear, but recognizes as true. All right. 2 agents in the shop around the clock. They will be customers in case the sheriff is watching. Agent Hayes will work the front. Agent Crawford will work the back. They will not leave you until the warrants are signed. 2 days later, 2 men in plain wool coats took up positions in the shop. They examined clocks. They drank coffee from the camp stove. They were polite to anyone who came in. Hayes was thick-shouldered and quiet. Crawford was slimmer and watched the windows. Hawking did not come to the shop that week, but on the Friday afternoon the sheriff drove past 3 times in his cruiser slowly. The way a man drives past a house where his wife is no longer welcome. He came on Monday at 4 in the afternoon. He walked in alone. He looked at Hayes and Crawford, and he laughed a single dry sound, and he turned to Hank at the workbench. "You think I don't know what they are? I was an officer in this Army Caldwell. I can smell a federal agent at 100 yards. Hank set down the loop he had been working with. "Sheriff, last chance, boy. You drop this. I leave town quiet. You keep the shop. We never see each other again. This is the only offer that ends without somebody bleeding. Sheriff, you killed 11 people at Castelvecchio. 3 of them were children. You killed Carson and Muller 5 weeks later. You drove my father into a false grave and let my mother die thinking she was a widow when she was not yet one. There is no offer you can make that ends this. There is only what comes next." Earl Hawking stood for a moment in the long, quiet shop, and for the first time something behind his eyes moved. That was not anger. It was something older and colder. It was the look of a man who has just understood that the road has ended. "All right then," he said. He turned and he walked out. Hayes followed him to the door and watched him drive away. Then Hayes walked back to where Hank was standing and said very quietly, "Tonight, Mr. Caldwell. Whatever he does, it will be tonight." It came at 3 in the morning. The bottle came through the front window with a sound like the war coming back. Glass and gasoline and the orange bloom of fire against the inside of the boarded sash. Hank was on his feet before the bottle hit the floor. He had the extinguisher in his hands before he was conscious of crossing the room. Crawford was already at the front beating the flames down with a wet blanket. Hayes was already out the back door at a run. The man who threw the bottle was not Earl Hawking. It was the deputy. Travis Burdick, 28 years old. His face white with adrenaline and fear. A second bottle still in his hand, and a kitchen match between his teeth. Hayes hit him low and took him off his feet on the sidewalk in front of the shop. The bottle rolled away unbroken. Burdick was on his back in the grit and the cold, and he was crying before the cuffs were on him. "He made me. He said if I didn't, he'd tell about the Red Cross money. He said he had paperwork. He said he'd send me to Windsor for 10 years. I have it written down. I have a journal. He took $8,000 out of the Red Cross fund in 1943. I have it. I have it written down. Please. Please." Inside the shop, the fire was out. The front wall was charred in a smear like a black flag. The window casing smoked. The shelves along the right side were untouched. The cotton sheets over the sleeping clocks had not even browned. And against the rear wall, untouched by smoke or flame, the master regulator stood watching its empty case, dark in the firelight. Agent Brennan was on the phone to the Boston office before 4. The federal warrant for Earl Hocking was signed at 4:11. 6 unmarked cars and 4 state police cruisers surrounded the small white farmhouse 3 miles north of Millbrook at 4:30. The lights came on inside. The front door opened. The sheriff came out in his shirt sleeves with his hands already raised, his face flat and old. He looked across the dooryard, across the heads of the federal men, and he found Hank Caldwell standing at the gate. "Your father was a fool, Caldwell. So are you. But you are a worse fool because you think this changes anything." Hank did not answer. He stood at the gate and watched the man who had killed his father by inches across 11 months and 3,000 miles, climbed into the back of an unmarked bureau car and disappear into a country that had finally come for him. The trial was held in the federal courthouse in Boston in June of 1946. Earl Hocking was indicted on 11 counts of murder in the Castelvecchio killings, 2 counts in the deaths of Carson and Muller, 1 count of witness intimidation against Theodore Caldwell, 1 count of arson, and 1 count of wartime fraud in the matter of the Red Cross Fund. Hank Caldwell took the stand on the 3rd morning. He read aloud from Elias Thornton's letter. He laid the 43 coins on the rail of the witness box in a soft, clinking row. He told the court what his father had done and what his father had not done. George Whitfield testified for 2.5 hours. He named the family. He named the children. He named Carson and Muller. He named the captain. He did not look at Hocking once. Frederick Westbrook testified. Edward Fairchild testified. Mabel Thornton testified. And on the 4th day, Walter Caldwell, 66 years old and barely able to hold the rail of the witness box, was helped to the stand by his grandson, and he read aloud slowly in his cracked, plain Yankee voice the last letter his son had written him from a boarding house in Sacramento. The jury was out for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Earl Hocking was convicted on every count. He was sentenced to life in the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, without the possibility of parole. He would die there of a heart attack in 1987, alone in the prison infirmary at the age of 79. And his death would not make the papers anywhere outside of central Pennsylvania. Outside the courthouse in the warm June sun on Tremont Street, a young reporter from the Boston Globe asked Hank Caldwell what he was thinking. The veteran looked down the street, then back at the man with the pencil. "I am thinking about my father," he said. "He spent the last 11 months of his life living under another man's name to keep his family safe. He died alone 3,000 miles from us. Today is the first day since I was a boy that I feel like my father can finally rest." The reporter wrote it down. The next morning it ran on the 2nd page of the Globe above a small photograph of a thin young man in a borrowed suit standing in front of the Federal Building. The photograph would be reprinted in the Burlington Free Press, the Rutland Herald, the Brattleboro Reformer, and eventually 2 months later, in a small column in the Sacramento Bee, where a retired Army sergeant who had once delivered 17 letters east would read it and weep over his coffee. But that was still ahead. The summer of 1946 was not yet finished with Hank Caldwell. The trial had ended. The shop was his. The gold would be held in federal custody for 2 more years. He drove back up to Vermont on the long road home with the windows of the Model A rolled down and the warm green countryside of western Massachusetts rolling past. And he understood that the largest part of his work, the part that no court could finish for him, had not yet even begun. He still had a promise to keep. A boy in a vineyard above Bologna had asked him with the last clear minute of his life to do something for a kid brother named Larry, 16 years old, in Burlington, Vermont. Hank had promised. He had not yet found his way to that door. He would find it in the autumn when a letter came from a woman named Helen Holloway. And the next part of his life, the longest part, the part that would finally make him whole, would begin. The letter from the FBI came in early September of 1946, in a plain envelope addressed in Caroline Brennan's careful hand. Inside was a single page of typed information and a small folded map of California. The plot was in Calvary Cemetery in Sacramento. The name on the headstone was John Mathers. The plot number was 711. Section C. Beneath the typed information in pen, Brennan had written 6 words. He waited a long time, Hank. He stood at the workbench of the shop in Millbrook, with the letter in his hand, and the September sun coming through the front window, which had been newly glazed and the casing repainted white. The master regulator stood at the rear wall ticking quietly now. He had reinstalled his father's mainspring in the spring. He had cleaned the gear train pivot by pivot. He had set the pendulum swinging on a cold April morning, and the clock had been keeping time ever since, an even unhurried beat that filled the long room with its steady presence. He had been waiting without quite knowing what for some signal that he was ready for the next thing the world was going to ask of him. The letter was the signal. He closed the shop. He drove the Model A north to Brattleboro and sat with Pop in the small apartment on Putnam Street and showed him the letter. Pop read it twice. He folded it carefully the way he folded everything, and he set it on the small table between them. "You're going," he said. "Yes, Pop." "Take both watches, mine and his. They have a right to be there." Pop got up out of his chair more slowly than he used to. He walked to the closet and brought down a small canvas duffel bag, Army issue from the First War. He set it on the table. Then he reached into his vest pocket and brought out the Hamilton he had carried for 27 years, the Pemberton watch from Belleau Wood, and he laid it on the table beside the duffel. This was Nathaniel Pemberton's, then mine, then yours when I am gone. For this trip, both watches traveled together. He never met my watch in life. He should meet it now. Hank packed the duffel that evening. 2 clean shirts, a wool sweater, both Hamilton Railroad watches in a cloth bag together. The one Pop had given him for the trip, and the one his father had hidden in the wall of a shop he would never see again. He left for California on the first morning of October. The drive took 11 days. He went west across upstate New York. He went down through Ohio and Indiana and Illinois on the old federal highways, the interstate system still a decade in the future. He slept in the truck cab in roadside pullouts. He ate in diners where men in coveralls did not ask him where he was going. He crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis on a steel bridge with the brown water running fast below. He drove west across Missouri and Kansas and the long red emptiness of eastern Colorado. He crossed the divide at Berthoud Pass with the truck laboring in second gear. He came down out of the Rockies into the high desert of Utah, and he drove across the salt flats with the white glare in his eyes for 100 miles. And he came down at last into Nevada and crossed the Sierra Nevada and rolled into the valley of the Sacramento River. On the afternoon of the 11th day, dusty and thin, and with both Hamiltons still wound and still ticking against his hip, Calvary Cemetery sat on a low rise at the edge of the city. He parked the truck on the gravel drive. He carried the duffel past the iron gate, past the small chapel, past the long lines of low stones in their orderly Catholic rows. He found Section C. He walked the row until he found the plot. The stone was small and plain, white marble. The lettering was simple. John Mathers, 1908 to 1945. A good man. Rest. He stood for a long time before the stone. He set the duffel down on the grass beside him. The October light in California was different from the October light in Vermont. It was thinner and more golden, and it slanted along the grass without the cool edge a Vermont October would have given it. The cemetery was quiet. A groundsman's rake worked somewhere 2 rows over and stopped and started again and stopped and was gone. He sat down on the grass beside the stone. He took both Hamilton watches out of the cloth bag. He held one in each hand. His father's in the right, Pop's in the left. He opened them both. They ticked together in the slanting golden light, 2 small hearts beating against the long quiet of the place. He read the engraving aloud quietly. TC 1944. For my son when he needs it. I needed it, Pop, he said to his father. I needed it the night I opened the wall. I needed it every day since. I came late. I'm sorry I came late. Mom is gone. Pop is still here. But he is old, and he is tired. Hawking is in Lewisburg, and he is going to die there. The shop is mine. The gold is on the record now. The truth is on the record now, and it isn't coming off. I kept your watch wound. Pop kept his wound. We did what we could. I want you to know I'm proud to be your son. I want you to know I am not sorry for any of you for any of it. I came as soon as I knew. I just wish I had known sooner. He laid the open watches on the headstone, side by side. He sat with his hand on the grass between them, and he did not cry. The crying had been done already on a plank floor in a Vermont shop in November of the previous year, and he had spent that crying. What he felt now was something cleaner and steadier. It was the slow, even tick of a thing that had finally been wound back up and set running. He stayed for 4 hours. The light went long and the shadows came up out of the grass, and a small wind moved through the cypresses at the edge of the cemetery. When he stood up to go, he picked up both Hamiltons from the headstone and closed them gently and put them back into the cloth bag. He had not come to leave the watches. He had come to bring them to the man who had earned them for as long as it took to say the thing that needed saying. The watches belonged with the living now. They would belong with the living until there was no one left in the line who knew how to wind them. He drove out of Sacramento the next morning. He drove east the long way home. He came back to Millbrook in late October. The maples were already past their peak and the leaves were coming down in slow yellow handfuls along Main Street. The Boston Globe story had spread through New England by then. People knew his name. They came to the shop with their pocket watches and their carriage clocks and their grandmother's mantel clocks, and they did not always have repair work to bring. Sometimes they brought a pie, or a jar of preserves, or a tin of coffee. Sometimes they only stood in the doorway and looked at the boy who had brought the captain home. In the first week of November, he received a letter postmarked Burlington. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and feminine and unfamiliar. He opened it at the workbench in the afternoon light. Dear Mr. Caldwell, I have wanted to write to you for over a year. I have not known how. When I read about you in the Globe in June, I knew I had to. My name is Helen Holloway. I am Danny's mother. I am writing to ask if you would come to Burlington. I would like to meet the man who was with my boy at the end. There is something I have for you that he wrote and never sent. Please come if you can. The address is below. Sincerely, Helen. He drove up the next Saturday. The drive was 90 miles across the long, quiet middle of Vermont, the lakes already skinned with their first thin ice. The Holloway house stood on a residential street near the lake white clapboard with a small porch, a porch swing with a folded quilt on it against the cold. Helen Holloway opened the door before he could knock. She was 52 years old. She had gone gray young. She took one look at him and her face folded the way a woman's face folds when the boy she has been waiting for is finally on her porch, and she put her arms around him and held him for a long moment in the open doorway in the cold. Behind her in the hallway stood a thin boy of 16 with red hair, and his brother's freckles and his brother's careful, watching way. Larry, Helen said, this is Hank, your brother's friend, the one who held him. The boy did not speak. He stuck out his hand the way boys of 16 stick out their hands when they have decided to be men. Hank took it. The handshake was firm and brief, and the boy looked away quickly because his eyes had begun to fill. And he was a boy of his generation in his country, and he would not cry in front of a stranger. Helen sat them at the kitchen table. She poured coffee. She put a plate of small cookies on the table, and they were good cookies, oatmeal and raisin. And Hank ate one without thinking. She brought down a tin box from a shelf above the stove. She opened it. She took out a single sheet of folded paper. He wrote this 2 days before. The chaplain found it in his jacket. The army sent it home with his things in June of '45. I read it the day it came. I have read it every Sunday since. I am giving it to you because it is for you. She gave it to him. He took it. He looked at her. I would rather read it alone, he said. Of course. He went out and sat on the porch swing in the November cold with the quilt over his legs. He opened the folded paper. He read his friend's hand for the first time in 19 months. Hank, if you are reading this, then I guess I did not make it. I am sorry. You are the best friend I ever had. You are the brother I never had. There is one thing I want you to do for me. My brother Larry is 16. He is growing up without a father, and now without me. My mother is a good woman, but she cannot teach him how to be a man. You can. Will you? You will be a better older brother than I ever was. I know you. Thank you for being my friend. Danny. Hank folded the letter. He folded it twice. He sat in the porch swing in the cold for a while longer. He listened to the small lake wind in the bare maples along the street. He understood that the next chapter had just begun, whether he was ready or not. He went back into the kitchen. Helen was at the sink with her back to the door. Larry was at the table pretending to read a school book. "Larry," Hank said. The boy looked up. "Come sit with me a minute." He stayed for dinner. He stayed for coffee after dinner. He drove back to Millbrook in the dark with the windshield wipers slow against a freezing rain, and he knew that for the rest of his life, he would have a brother he had inherited from a man who had died holding his hand. He drove up to Burlington once a month after that, all through the winter, all through the spring, all through the summer of 1947. He took Larry fishing on the Connecticut River in April when the ice went out. He taught him to change a points and condenser on the Model A. He took him out into the back parking lot of the Methodist church and showed him how to throw a real punch with his hips and not his shoulder, because there was a kid at the high school who had been giving him trouble. And Helen, in the doorway of the kitchen with her arms folded, had given Hank a single nod that meant she would not see what she was about to see. The boy threw the punch the next Monday. The trouble stopped. In the summer of 1948, when Larry turned 18, Hank brought him down to the shop in Millbrook for the first time. He sat the boy on the wooden stool at the workbench. He put the Waltham, Danny's Waltham, the one Danny had pressed into his hand, in the vineyard above Bologna, on the cloth mat between them. "Open it, Larry." The boy opened the case. He looked at the movement inside. "Tell me what you hear." The boy listened. For a long moment he did not say anything. Then he said, "There is a small sound, like a little bird beating its wings. But the beats are not even. The right one is a little longer than the left." Hank sat very still on his side of the bench. "Say that again." "The right one is a little longer than the left. The escapement is out of balance." Is that the word? It was the word. The boy had pulled it out of the air without knowing where it came from. The same word Pop had used on a kitchen bench in Millbrook in 1933. You have the ear, Larry. There is a name for what you have. There is a trade for it. Do you want to learn? The boy looked at him across the workbench in the afternoon light coming through the front window of the shop, and his face was the face of a young man who had not been chosen for anything before in his life. "Yes," he said. "Yes." He taught him for 4 summers from 1948 through 1952. He taught him the way Pop had taught him. He taught him to clean a movement with benzene and a horsehair brush. He taught him to oil a pivot. He taught him to feel the temper of a mainspring with his fingertips. He taught him to regulate by ear. And in the fall of 1952, Larry Holloway opened his own watchmaker's bench in a corner of a jeweler's shop in Burlington. And he kept that bench for 48 years. And he repaired by his own count somewhere north of 11,000 timepieces in the steady working life that followed. Hank married Eleanor Whitcomb in the spring of 1953. She had been a 4th-grade teacher at the Millbrook Elementary School for 3 years. She came into the shop in October of 1952 with a pocket watch that had belonged to her father, who had been a conductor on the Boston and Maine Railroad, and she had stood at the workbench while Hank examined the movement and she had asked him whether he was the boy from the Boston Globe story. And he had said, "Yes, ma'am." And she had said very quietly, "Then I should very much like to bring you my mother's mantel clock as well if you have time." She brought the mantel clock the next week. She brought a tin of biscuits the week after that. By Christmas, she was bringing him supper in a covered dish on Wednesdays, and by April he had asked her to marry him at the workbench in the late light. And she had said yes before he had finished asking. The night before the wedding, he sat with her at the small table in her parents' kitchen, and he told her slowly and carefully, and from the beginning the whole of it, Castelvecchio, his father's 2 deaths, the 11 months in Sacramento, the trial in Boston, the gold, the shop, Danny, Larry, everything. He told her because she had a right to know what kind of man she was marrying and what kind of weight came with him. She listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she sat for a long time looking at her hands on the table. Then she looked up. "I will love you more for it," she said, "not less." She loved him more for it for the next 55 years. Their daughter, Lillian, was born in 1955. She would grow up to be a pediatrician in Burlington and would marry late and have no children of her own. And she would be at her father's side when each of his old grievances was finally laid down. Their son, Theodore, was born in 1958, named for the grandfather he would never meet, and he would grow up to be a bridge engineer for the state of Vermont and would have 3 sons and a small white farmhouse outside Montpelier, and would call his father on the first Sunday of every month for 40 years. Pop died at home in the apartment on Putnam Street in 1962. 82 years old in his sleep with the Pemberton Hamilton on the nightstand still ticking. Hank wound the watch the next morning and put it in his own pocket and carried it from that day forward the same way Pop had carried it for the 44 years before, and the same way Nathaniel Pemberton had carried it for the few short months. Between his enlistment and his death at Belleau Wood, from then on Hank carried 2 watches against his hip, Pop's in his right pocket, his father's in his left. Larry Holloway married a girl from St. Albans in 1957. Their son Wesley was born in 1958. Wesley grew up around his father's bench in the Burlington jeweler's shop. In the summer of 1967, when Wesley was 9 years old, Larry brought him down to Millbrook for 2 weeks the way Hank had brought Larry down 19 years before. Hank sat the boy on the wooden stool at the same workbench. He put a small mantel clock between them. He said, "Tell me what you hear." The boy listened. After a minute, the boy looked up and said, "It is uneven. The left side is faster than the right side. The clock is gaining time." Hank sat back on his own stool and looked at the boy for a long moment, and he understood that the ear had skipped a generation and landed again, and that the trade would not die in his lifetime. He taught Wesley every summer from 1967 to 1976. Wesley took the trade further than any of them. He went to a horological school in Pennsylvania in 1977. He worked for a custom shop in Philadelphia for 11 years. He was hired by the Smithsonian in 1988 as a conservator in the history of technology, and by the year 2000 he was the senior horological conservator at the museum restoring presidential pocket watches and astronomical regulators and the chronometers from Civil War ironclads. In 2001, Wesley Holloway had a son. He named him Daniel for the great-uncle who had died in an Italian vineyard 56 years before. The boy was called Danny. He would not meet his namesake's friend until the autumn of 2010, when he was 9 years old when his father brought him to Vermont to deliver some news. Earl Hawking had died in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary on the 14th of January, 1987. Sudden cardiac event in the prison infirmary. He had served 40 years and 7 months of a life sentence. He had received no visitors during any of those years. His remains had been claimed by no family and had been buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked plot. Hank received the news from Caroline Brennan, by then long retired from the bureau, but still in correspondence in a short note delivered by Sunday mail. He had read the note at the workbench in the shop, and he had thought, there it is then. He had folded the note and put it in the bottom drawer of the bench with the other letters that mattered, and he had gone back to the small carriage clock he had been cleaning. The cleaning had taken him another 45 minutes. He had been 60 years old. Eleanor had come into the shop at 5 o'clock with a sandwich and a cup of tea. And he had told her, and she had set the sandwich down on the bench and put her arms around him from behind her cheek against the side of his head. And she had not said anything for a long time. There had been no need. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2008. Stroke. She had been 79 years old. She had taken her morning coffee in the kitchen with the radio low, and she had set the cup down, and she had said, "Henry," and that was all. He had been at the workbench in the shop 20 feet from the kitchen, and he had heard her say his name in a tone he had never heard from her before, and he had reached her in 7 seconds, and she was already gone. He kept the shop open. He did not know any other way to be. In the autumn of 2010, on a clear Saturday in mid-October, when the maples along Mill Street were burning red and the air smelled of cold apples and wood smoke, a man and a small boy walked in through the door of the shop. The man was 52 years old, red-headed going gray, his face a milder echo of his uncle's face. The boy was 9 also, red-headed, also freckled his eyes, the same careful watching eyes that had looked across the workbench in Burlington in November of 1946. "Uncle Hank," Wesley said, "I'd like you to meet my son." The boy stepped forward. He extended his hand the way his great-uncle had extended his hand at the door of a small house in Burlington in November of 1946. "Hello, Mr. Caldwell," he said. "I'm Daniel." Hank Caldwell, 84 years old, sat on the wooden stool at the workbench he had used for 65 years, and he took the boy's hand. He held it a moment longer than a handshake. "You can call me Hank, or you can call me Uncle Hank, whatever feels right." "I will call you Uncle Hank." Wesley had business to discuss. The Smithsonian wanted the gold. After the federal custody had lapsed in 1949, the 43 Liberty Quarter Eagles, each bearing the small struck mark in TA-44, had come back to Hank, and he had put them in a small safe behind the master regulator, and he had not touched them since. Wesley had been talking on and off for 2 years with the curator of the National Numismatic Collection and with the chief historian of the museum's Military History Division. They wanted the coins. They wanted the letters. They wanted the deed. They wanted the photograph of Theodore Caldwell in his sergeant's uniform from 1942. They wanted the whole story told straight in a permanent installation on the second floor of the Museum of American History, with the title cards and the casework and the lighting all done in the way the Smithsonian did such things. They were offering $4.2 million. Wesley laid out the offer at the workbench. Hank listened. The boy stood beside the master regulator at the back of the shop. His head tilted, his ear inclined toward the case. When Wesley finished, Hank looked over at the boy. "What do you think, young man?" The boy turned around. He thought about it for a moment. He was 9. He had been raised to think about things before he spoke about them. "I think my great-uncle Danny would have wanted people to know what happened. I think my great-great-uncle Teddy would have wanted that too. I think they would want everyone to be able to read it, not just us. So I think you should say yes." Hank looked at his great-grandnephew across the length of the shop. He looked at his student's son, who was now his student's grown man, and at his student's son's son, who would be his student in turn, if he wanted to be. "I think you are right," he said. Wesley stepped outside to take a phone call from the Smithsonian's curator. Hank Caldwell and Daniel Holloway III sat alone in the long shop on Mill Street, with the maples burning red outside the front window, and the master regulator ticking quietly at the back of the room. And the boy spoke. "Uncle Hank, may I tell you something I hear?" "Tell me, son." "That clock, the big one, the right tick is a little longer than the left, maybe 1/100th of a second. The escapement is a little out. The clock is gaining time, very slowly, but gaining." Hank closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. He stood up off the stool and walked to the back of the shop and opened the glass door of the master regulator's case and laid his ear against the cherry wood. And he listened the way Pop had taught him to listen 77 years before. And the boy was right. The clock was gaining. Not much. A fraction of a second a day. The kind of drift only an apprentice with the ear could hear. He came back to the bench. "Daniel," he said, "come sit on the stool here." The boy climbed up onto the stool. Hank pulled up his own stool, the one Pop had brought from the Cedar Street kitchen in 1945, and given to him with the words, "You will need this where you are going." He sat beside the boy. He reached into his left pocket and took out the engraved Hamilton, his father's watch, and laid it on the cloth mat between them. He opened the case. The escapement moved its small, steady beat against the quiet of the shop. "This was my father's. He had it engraved in a hospital in Florence in 1944, when he knew he was going to have to disappear for a while. He sent it home so I would know he had lived past the day they told me he died. I never met him after I was 18, but I have wound this watch every morning at 6 o'clock for 65 years. The way my grandfather wound his watch for 60 years before that. The way the man who gave the watch to my grandfather wound it for a few short months. At the front in 1918 before he died. There is no break in the line. Do you understand what I am telling you?" The boy nodded. "Now I am going to teach you the first lesson. The same lesson my grandfather taught me on a kitchen bench in this town in 1933. Look at this watch and tell me what you see." The boy leaned forward over the open case. He looked for a long minute. "I see gears," he said, "and a balance wheel, and a little lever clicking against a wheel with teeth. It looks like a heart." Hank Caldwell closed his eyes for a moment. He did not open them right away. "That is exactly what my grandfather told me, Daniel. Almost word for word. He said, 'This is not a watch. This is a heart.' And he said, 'A man is the same. If his heart beats even, he lives well. If it beats crooked, he dies young.' I have thought about that sentence every day of my life. I'm going to give you the same sentence now. You take it with you. You hold it. You will know what to do with it when the time comes." The boy nodded again very seriously. He laid his ear next to the open watch and closed his eyes and listened. Hank watched him. He understood that the trade was gonna live. The deal was signed in December. The money was divided in thirds. 1/3 went to the Caldwell Family Trust for Lillian and Theodore Jr. and Theodore's 3 sons. 1/3 went to the Holloway Family Trust for Larry's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and the family Danny had never lived to have. 1/3 was set aside as the founding endowment of the Walter Caldwell and Elias Thornton Foundation, an educational fund for the children and grandchildren of American servicemen to be administered out of a small office in Burlington, run by Theodore Jr. in his retirement. The exhibit opened at the Smithsonian on a clear, cold morning in March of 2012. Hank Caldwell, 86 years old, now walked into the National Museum of American History on the arm of his son, Theodore Jr., with his daughter Lillian on his other side. Behind them came Wesley Holloway and his wife, and his 10-year-old son, and Larry Holloway, 82 years old, leaning on a cane but upright. And behind Larry came his other grandchildren, and a small, careful crowd of the families who had carried this story between them for 66 years. The case was on the 2nd floor near the World War II gallery. The 43 coins lay on a velvet field under museum glass. Above them were the photographs. Theodore Caldwell in his sergeant's uniform in 1942, on the front step of the Cedar Street house in Millbrook, his arm around his 16-year-old son. Walter Caldwell at the workbench in 1948, white-haired, his loop set in his eye. Elias Thornton in his shop in 1926. Danny Holloway and Hank Caldwell at the replacement depot in Naples in January of 1945. Both of them grinning at the camera over their mess tins. Neither of them yet 21. The case was titled in plain capital letters cut in cherry wood above the glass. The Listening. Wesley had curated the case himself. Hank stood for a long time in front of the glass. He did not say anything. Daniel, 10 years old now, stood beside him, his small hand inside his great-uncle's big, rough one. After a while, Hank bent down a little and spoke quietly to the boy. "My father is in their son. So is my friend. So is your grandfather's brother. They have a place now. People will know who they were. They have a place because of you, Uncle Hank. No, they have a place because of all of us. That is the difference." He came home to Millbrook that evening. He slept badly. He woke early. He went down to the shop in the cold gray light before dawn, and he wound the master regulator, and he wound both his Hamiltons, and he opened the shutters, and he sat on the stool at the workbench, and he listened to the long room come awake around him in its old familiar way. He worked another 2 years. He worked them slowly with shorter hours with Daniel beside him on the Saturdays, when Wesley brought the boy up from Washington. He taught the boy to clean a movement with benzene and a horsehair brush. He taught him to oil a pivot with a single drop on the tip of a needle. He taught him to listen for fatigue in a mainspring. He taught him to regulate a balance wheel by turning the screw a quarter turn at a time, listening then a quarter turn again. He taught him slowly in no hurry the way Pop had taught him, the way Pop had been taught by an old man in a Waltham factory in 1898. The lessons traveled forward through hands. He died on a Saturday morning in October of 2014, 88 years old, at the workbench in the long shop on Mill Street. He had wound both Hamiltons at 6 in the morning the way he had for 52 years since Pop's death. He had wound the master regulator at 7. He had put the coffee on. He had laid out his tools. At 10 o'clock, Wesley's car pulled into the gravel drive behind the shop. And Daniel, 13 years old, now came in alone through the back door with 2 paper bags from the bakery in Bellows Falls. Hank was on his stool at the workbench, the open Hamilton in front of him, a small screwdriver in his hand. He had been midway through cleaning a pivot. He had set the screwdriver down on the cloth mat in a careful, exact line with the open case, the way he had been taught 78 years before, never to leave a tool where it could roll. He was sitting upright. His eyes were closed. He looked as if he had simply paused to listen. The boy set down the bags. He came around to the side of the bench. He looked at his great-uncle. He understood at once. He did not run for his father. He did not cry. He pulled up his own stool, the one Pop had used in 1933, at a kitchen bench in this same town, and he sat down beside the old man, and he laid his small hand over Hank's big, rough, cold one on the workbench. The master regulator ticked at the back of the shop. Both Hamiltons ticked on the bench. The morning light came through the front window and made a long, pale bar across the plank floor. The same plank floor a homeless boy had sat down on in November of 1945, with a letter in his hand. And the boy looked across the bench at the photograph on the shelf, the one of his great-grandfather Pop at this same workbench in 1948, with the loop in his eye. And he understood that he was the one now. He was the one who would wind these watches. He was the one who would keep the listening going. He sat with his great-uncle for almost an hour before he stood up and walked to the back door and called his father in from the car. Wesley came in. He looked at his uncle. He laid his hand on the old man's shoulder. He did not speak for a long time. Then he looked at his son. "How long, Daniel?" "About an hour." "Were you alone with him?" "Yes, Dad. I sat with him." "Good." The funeral was held in the cemetery on the hill above Millbrook on a clear, cold day at the end of October. Larry Holloway was there in a wheelchair pushed by Wesley. Lillian and Theodore Jr. were there with their families. Caroline Brennan was not having died 10 years before, but a wreath came from her daughter in Boston. Edward Fairchild and Mabel Thornton and Frederick Westbrook and George Whitfield were all long gone. But their grandchildren came, almost 24 of them, from all over New England, carrying small old objects that Hank had repaired for them or for their fathers across the decades. The line of people waiting to lay something on the grave reached around the chapel. Daniel Holloway III stood beside his great-uncle's open grave in a borrowed dark suit, the engraved Hamilton in his right pocket, and Pop's Pemberton Hamilton in his left. And when his turn came, he stepped forward and laid a folded piece of paper on the casket. He had written it the night before by himself, at his great-uncle's kitchen table. He stepped back. The minister gave the final benediction. The men with shovels came forward. Wesley turned to his son. "What did you write, Daniel?" The boy looked up at his father. His eyes were dry. They were the careful, watching eyes that had looked across a workbench in this same town in the autumn of 1933, and again in 1948, and again in 1967, and again in 2010. I wrote, "I will not let it stop." Wesley Holloway closed his hand over his son's shoulder, and the two of them stood together at the edge of the grave in the cold October light. And somewhere down in the village below them, in a long, quiet shop on Mill Street, with the door locked for the first weekend in 69 years, a master regulator ticked on against the silence. Even and unhurried, and 2 Hamilton pocket watches ticked with it, and the listening went on 1 tick at a time, the way it had always gone, on the way it would go on for as long as there was a boy in the line who knew how to wind a spring and how to start a clock, and how to slow down enough to hear the difference between a heart that beat even and a heart that beat crooked. That is the story. That is the listening that does not stop. That is what an old man carries forward through his hands until the hands belong to someone else, until the watches belong to someone else, until the trade itself belongs to someone else. And the line goes on, and the line goes on, and the line goes on.